Hello Year 9, it's Miss Jennings here. I just thought I'd record this revision lesson to help you prepare for your history assessment that will be coming up at the start of July. So you'll be doing the assessment on Schoology just like the one you completed in January. So you need to make sure that you are able to log on to your Schoology account. If any of you are having trouble with logging on to that, just drop me an email and I can help you sort out that. Okay? So just like your January assessment, you will start by completing multiple choice questions to test your knowledge. Then you'll be analysing a source, and I'll be showing you how to go about that at the end of this video. And then you'll do a piece of extended writing. Again, like the assessment that you did in January, you know you're being tested on your knowledge from year 7 and 8 and also what you had learnt from year 9 history up until January, and then also what you were learning after that. So I've got some pictures here on this slide that sort of show those. So we're looking at 1920s America, and I've got two pictures there on the left. So one of flapper women, because we know women gained much more social freedom in the 1920s. And then underneath that, we have a picture of men protesting against prohibition. Okay. Another topic that we looked at is the outbreak of the Second World War. So got a newspaper article there showing that declaration of war with Britain and France against Germany. And underneath that, I have a picture of Mussolini and Hitler, because we also looked at the rise of dictatorships in Europe. I've also got a picture there of the evacuation of Dunkirk, so that's also part of the Second World War. And that final picture there on the far right is of Vladimir Lenin, so thinking about the Russian Revolution. So the purpose then of this lesson is to revise 1920s America and the Second World War. So to be able to do that, we're going to be recalling the key features of 1920s America. We're going to recall the causes and events of the Second World War, and then we're going to be analysing a primary source to assess its usefulness. And for those of you who want to stretch your thinking, I've got two challenge questions there at the bottom. So the first one is, could the Allies have won the Second World War without the support of the Home Front? And the other question there is, did every American benefit from the economic boom that was taking place throughout the 1920s? So those are just there for you to think of if you want to stretch your thinking. So first of all, we're just going to take a look at 1920s America. If you want to pause this video and read through the information in your own time, that might be a good idea, because I'm just going to be talking through it quite quickly. So during the 1920s, we know that there was an economic boom in America after the First World War. So during the First World War, a lot of American businesses and industries were producing and manufacturing a lot more goods than they had before, particularly weapons, munitions, and steel and iron, things like that. So products that were being used by the Allies in the First World War in Europe. So they were making a lot of money in America by selling those. But even after the First World War ended, these businesses wanted to keep on going. So we see the mass production of consumer goods. So they start making things like fridges, radios, vacuum cleaners, washing machines. And as they're making more and more of those goods, the price comes down because there's more of them available. And this means that the average American is now able to buy these consumer goods for pretty much the first time. We also see car ownership increasing, particularly thanks to Henry Ford and the new Model T. And we looked at how he was able to make this car affordable for the average American. Hire purchase also allowed more Americans to afford all of these new goods. So hire purchase is basically you would buy a fridge, for example, and instead of paying for that all in one go, you would pay for it in monthly instalments, so in smaller chunks, and that just made it more affordable for Americans to be buying all of these new goods. So you could say, for the average American who could afford all of these things, 1920s America was a pretty roaring time, as historians have described it, because of this wealth that was circulating around. So there was also a lot of social freedom emerging for the first time, particularly amongst women. So attitudes towards women changed after the First World War, As their husbands and fathers and sort of other male relatives were going away to fight in the war, the women stayed in America and they were taking up these jobs that were left behind. So this meant that they had entered the world of work. And even after the First World War, even though the men came back, women still wanted to engage in this world of work. So previously, before that, they were confined to something called the private sphere. They were confined to the home. They were expected to look after their home, make sure it was clean. If they were wealthy, they'd be expected to manage servants, and they'd be expected to look after the children. Okay. However, as they entered the world of work, they had gained this sort of sense of freedom and independence, and they were earning money for the first time. So they did not want to give this up. And with that, we see the increase in flapper women. So remember, these are fashionable young women who were enjoying all of this new freedom. And they had quite an iconic look, so they would wear short skirts, they'd have bobbed hair, and they would be happy to smoke and drink in public. And they're really a symbol of this newfound social freedom for women in society throughout the 1920s. Entertainment also flourished in America at the time, particularly with jazz culture, and as more people are able to afford radios, more people are listening to music in the home, so we really see that flourish at the time. Other forms of popular entertainment also developed, particularly the cinema, and then we see Hollywood stars emerging really for the first time, and they have a lot more influence on society than they had ever had before. So the economic boom, women, and this sort of popular entertainment really show the positive side to life in 1920s America. But as you remember from what we looked at, there is a darker side to this decade. So the first example of that we're going to think about again is Prohibition and gangsters. So starting to think of Prohibition then, in January 1920, Prohibition ensured that alcohol was now illegal, so you could no longer sell or drink it legally. And they also introduced something called the Volstead Act, which meant if you broke this law, so if you were selling alcohol or drinking it, this was punishable, a punishable offence, so you were officially committing a crime. But this didn't stop Americans from engaging with alcohol, as we see the emergence of something called speakeasies. So these were illegal drinking bars where people could sell alcohol and drink it in secret. We also saw something called moonshiners emerging. So these were people who would distill or make their own alcohol at home. And it's important to remember, when Prohibition was introduced to America, the aim was that crime would go down because there would be less drunk people because drinking alcohol was now legal. But as you can see, the average American enjoying a drink that they'd made at home or going to a speakeasy meant that more and more people were breaking the law simply by drinking alcohol. So actually, in this way, crime had increased. More serious forms of crime also increased, however, as we see organised gangsters emerging in every city, and one of the most famous of those being Al Capone. We also looked at something called racketeering, and this was the way that gangsters were able to make money. So they would do this by offering to sell protection to a business. But if the business refused to purchase protection, that would allow the gangsters to target them and attack them. So they may attack the business owner, their family, or the building that their business operates from. When we look at 1920s America, it's also important to think of the experiences of Black Americans. So, although slavery had been abolished in the 1860s, Jim Crow laws still existed throughout America, and these laws would operate in different states, and they ensured that Black Americans still faced widespread racism, discrimination, and segregation throughout the country. So just because slavery had officially ended, we need to remember that those ideas of racism are still embedded in people's minds. They don't just go away just because slavery had become illegal. We also see a group called the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, and this is a racist group who targeted Black Americans throughout the country. and they were often guilty for something called lynchings. Remember, lynchings is when a black American could be killed by hanging without a trial by someone in these groups. It is important to remember that black Americans were able to celebrate their culture in the 1920s for the first time. So despite these negativities associated with racism and discrimination, in certain pockets of America, we do see black Americans celebrating their culture through the Harlem Renaissance and through this jazz culture that we see flourishing. But although they have that positive experience, that doesn't wipe away the large-scale problem that they were facing at the time because of how widespread racism, discrimination and segregation were throughout America at the time. So just as an overview, when we think of 1920s America, it's not really easy to say it was a roaring, brilliant decade for everyone or it was a terrible time for everyone, because it's more complex than that. So you can see from this overview the experiences of women, of Hollywood stars, of black Americans, of gangsters, of those involved in speakeasies and moonshiners, or those who benefited from the economic boom, all had quite different experiences within this decade. The next topic that we're going to be thinking about then is the Second World War. So just to start by thinking of the causes, we need to have a think about the end of the First World War. So Hitler felt that Germany had been really unfairly treated by the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. He thought that the treaty was far too harsh, and he really wanted to build Germany back up again to what he believed was its former glory. And he was going to do that by invading other countries, taking over their land to make Germany and the land that Germany was in control of much bigger. So this was called gaining Lebensraum, so gaining a living space for Germans. And he did this by sort of invading other countries to take them over and have them under his control. And he started doing this with Austria, and then he moved on to the Sudetenland, and then he moved on to Czechoslovakia. And as he was doing this, the British Prime Minister, a man called Neville Chamberlain, was watching. And he did have a problem with it, but he didn't want to declare war on Hitler because he was thinking back to the First World War. He wanted to avoid another whole-scale world war. So he followed something called appeasement, which means he was giving in to Hitler's demands. So Hitler would say that he wanted to take over another country, and Chamberlain was sort of allowing him to do that because he was reluctant to declare war on Germany again. However, the final straw for Chamberlain was when Hitler invaded Poland. So Chamberlain said, that's the final straw. I told you to not do that, but you've decided to. And that resulted in Britain declaring war on Germany in 1939. So when we're looking at the war as a whole, we see two alliances forming who are fighting against each other. So the first alliance that we've got is something called the Allied Powers, and within that we have Britain, the USSR, so Russia, France and America. And they are fighting against the Axis powers, which include Germany and their allies of Italy and Japan. So these are sort of the two main alliances that are fighting against each other. Thinking of the major events that we looked at in the Second World War, so your first sort of home learning task was looking at these key events as turning points. So just to recap what they are, I've put them on a little timeline there for you. So we start with that invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939, and as a result, Britain declared war on Germany following that. Then in 1940, we see the British troops evacuating from Dunkirk, and we've got the Battle of Britain taking place while civilians are also in that year experiencing the Blitz. In 1941 we have Operation Barbarossa, so remember that's the code name for the German invasion of the Soviet Union, and this was ultimately a failure for Germany, and it left the Eastern Front open for a Soviet counter-offensive in the winter of 1941, so that was sort of a key failure for Germany. Also in that year though, we have the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Then in 1944, we have the Normandy beach landings, which I've got a photo of there in the bottom right. So this is the Allies landing on those beaches, and it's known as D-Day. And then in 1945, we see the war ending after America drops the bomb on Hiroshima and Japan finally surrendered. So when you're looking at revising the Second World War, be helpful to think of it in terms of causes and then what happened during those key events that I've just outlined for you. So the last thing we're going to look at then is how we go about source analysis. So I've just got a reminder there for you that historians use sources to find out about the past, but you need to think in what ways are sources useful for finding out particular things. So what can you tell about a certain topic just by reading them? So the question I've got there at the top in yellow is, how useful is this source for an inquiry into how successful prohibition was in America? So that question basically means, how useful is this source for finding out about whether or not people in America were following prohibition? So were Americans really no longer drinking alcohol, no longer selling alcohol, no longer having alcohol around them? So just some information on the source there. It says this is by Felix von Luckner, and he is a German visitor to the United States, and he's writing about his thoughts on prohibition whilst he's there in 1927. So this is what he had to say. In time, I learned that not everything in America was what it seemed to be. I discovered, for instance, that a spare tire could be filled with substances other than air. So you'd have to think about what that might mean. So we always start with source analysis by looking at the content. So what is it you've just read and what does that tell you? So from my initial thoughts reading that, it says that not everything in America is as it seemed to be. That suggests that actually not everyone in America is following prohibition. And then he goes on to explain that a spare tire could be filled with substances other than air. So he's suggesting that people might be hiding alcohol in strange places in America, that actually prohibition wasn't successful because people are going to the extreme length of hiding alcohol in a car tyre, for example. So it's showing that people aren't really following prohibition. It's unsuccessful. So that's what we've got from the content. Then we look at the nature of this source. So what type of source is it? So this is in a book that Felix von Luckner published. Does this make it more or less useful? Well, to me, it suggests that the watching world are finding it quite interesting with America going through prohibition if a German visitor is going to the length of writing about it. But thinking of the nature of that, is that really useful for telling us about how successful prohibition was? Perhaps not as much as the content. Next, we have a think about the origin. So who produced the source, when, where, and how is knowing this useful? So this was produced by a German visitor. So it's someone coming into America, into this world where alcohol is illegal. Why is that useful for us? That's something that you need to be thinking about. Okay. And then the purpose of this source. Why was it produced? And then how does that make it useful? So you need to think, why would a German visitor be writing about prohibition in America, or writing about people not following the law? They're actually happy to be keeping alcohol in secret. So you need to think of the purpose of that. Now, it's important to remember that a source is always useful, because once you read it, the content always tells you something that you didn't know before. But you also need to remember that a single source can't tell you everything about a topic. So this one has suggested that not everyone is following prohibition, as Americans might like you to believe. So this is where you need to bring in your own knowledge to explain what the source doesn't tell you. So I'd like you to have a think. What other examples do you know of where people weren't actually obeying the law and they were happy to be drinking and selling alcohol? So have a think about that. So once you've thought about it, you might have come up with ideas such as speakeasies, remember, which were those illegal underground bars. So that tells us that prohibition was also unsuccessful because people were drinking alcohol in that context. You also might have thought about gangsters, because remember, these gangs are selling alcohol and making lots of money off it. So we know that that's another way that prohibition was unsuccessful. So you could argue that the source is limited in its usefulness because it doesn't tell us that side of it. So that's just something to be thinking about. So just to finish then, we've had a look at 1920s America and the causes and events of the Second World War. As you continue with your revision, I would really recommend having a look on Quizlet, because we've got some revision cards on there for all of the topics you've looked at through Year 9. And if you also want to start having a think about the content covered in Year 7 and 8, there are some helpful revision cards on there also.